Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening, everybody. I am very happy to be here tonight, and I don't know whether they announced the topic of tonight's presentation or not, but it's called The Meaning and the Practice of Piety. Piety is a very important value, an essential value in all world religions. It is part and parcel to the religious lifestyle. You cannot think of the religious lifestyle without piety being center and focal in it. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they articulate and formulate their views on piety differently. But nonetheless, piety is critical to all of them. Tonight, however, I will present to you piety from the viewpoint of Islam. And here is what I'm going to share with you tonight. First, what does piety mean? Secondly, what are some of the misconceptions about piety? And thirdly, what are some of the tangible benefits of piety? So a person who is pious, what kind of benefits would he draw from his piety? And lastly, if we have time, I'm going to briefly talk about how we can boost our piety. So these are the four topics or four items that I will talk about tonight. You see, every religion and every philosophical school of thought offers its followers a criterion to evaluate their excellence. Every single philosophical school of thought does that. Every religion does that. It offers a standard to judge and rank. But let me also clarify something at the very outset. When I say that every religion offers a criterion to judge and rank, it doesn't mean that we should use this criterion to judge other people. See, one of the pitfalls in religious life is that typically religious people use the standard that religion gives them in order to judge other people, right? We all see that on a daily basis. People are very judgmental. Unfortunately, it happens quite often that, for example, Muslims use their holy book, their sacred scripture, the Quran, in order to pass judgment on Christians. Christians, on the other hand, use their sacred scripture, the Bible, in order to pass judgments on Muslims. And guess what? If a Muslim uses the Quran to judge Christians, Christians will definitely not pass the bar. They will fail. So the point is not really to use our sacred scripture in order to judge other people, right? I am convinced that God will not use a single sacred scripture in order to judge all humanity. So a Muslim should really use the Quran as a mirror, just as a mirror. Look into it and see how you measure up to the expectations of the Quran for a submitter, for a Muslim. That's really the whole purpose of it. That's the same holds true for Christians, Jews, Buddhists, so on and so forth. So I really believe that if we treat our sacred scripture as a mirror to judge our own self rather than other people, it's going to go a long way in order to diffuse a lot of the religious tensions and misunderstandings that exist around the world. So now let me go back to my original point. As I mentioned, every religion, every even social system offers a criterion to evaluate human excellence. Let me ask you a question. What do you think the criterion is for a philosopher? What is the criterion that philosophers use in order to measure a person's excellence? It is rational capacity, right? Rational ability, the capacity to reason, or in Farsi, in Arabic, we say aql, right? The more somebody is rational, the better that person is from the viewpoint of a philosopher. How about aristocracies? In aristocracies, the criterion for excellence is blood lineage, which family you come from. It is not your individual personal accomplishments that matters, but your pedigree. The family that you come from determines your value. Well, we live in a modern capitalist system. What is the criterion in a capitalist system? How does capitalism judge and rank people? It's the almighty dollar, right? That's how we judge people. The goodness, the net worth. Literally, isn't that funny? I mean, when we fill out applications and they say, what is your net worth? And we always list our financial assets. We never think about that. I mean, we just do it day in and day out without paying attention to what it really means. So the net worth of a person in a capitalist social system is the financial assets of the person. Well, how about Islam? So let's talk about Islam. How does Islam value humanity? As you all know, Islam emerged in Arabia in a tribal and aristocratic setting. Because it emerged in an aristocratic setting, obviously pedigree and bloodline was very important in that society. It was against this backdrop that Islam really turned the social value system, the prevailing value system, on its head, turned everything upside down. Islam declared that God does not judge a person's worth by gender, by race, blood lineage, IQ, right, how smart you are. It does not by your financial assets, your celebrity status. Even God does not judge the worth of a person by her religious beliefs, not even by her religious denomination, right? None of these constitute the criteria for God's judgment. The yardstick that God uses, according to the Quran, to judge a person's worth is piety. The Islamic term for piety, as you know, is Taqwa. So Taqwa is the yardstick that God uses in order to judge humanity. Taqwa, therefore, is the sign of distinction. The sign of distinction. Chapter 49, verse 13 in the Quran informs us that this is the yardstick of God. Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min zakarin wa unsa, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, inna allaha alimun khabir. People, we created you all from a single man and a single woman, and made you into nations and tribes so that you should get to know one another. In God's eyes, the most honored of you are the ones most pious. The most honored of you are the ones most pious. God is all-knowing, all-aware. By the way, tonight, I will always, whenever I make a quotation, I will do it in the original language, whether Arabic or Farsi, and then I will translate it into English. Now, this verse, which is, in my opinion, one of the most profound verses in all of the Quran, if you ask me to pick 10 verses in the Quran that are just fundamental to the Islamic worldview, this would be one of them. This verse clearly establishes, number one, that it stresses the unity of the human race, right? It clearly refutes the notion of ethnic or racial superiority. So none of that exists in Islam. Secondly, it states that it was God's intention for people to live in harmony. It was God's design for the human race to live in harmony, to get to know one another and not fight each other due to our differences. And lastly, obviously, it establishes the criterion of excellence and distinction, which is taqwa. Now, the Islamic concept of taqwa is quite different from the word piety in the English language, and that's where a lot of the misunderstanding come from, and let me clarify that. Piety comes from the Latin word pieta. Okay, if you look up pieta, and if you Google that, pieta means devout or dutiful. Devout or dutiful. In the Roman Empire, pieta was a distinguishing virtue. People who had pieta were distinguished in society. Cicero, the famous Roman philosopher, defined pietas in the following manner. He said, pieta is the virtue which admonishes us to do our duty to our country, our parents, or other blood relations. So you can consider this the secular definition for piety. So in the secular definition of piety, piety is the fulfillment of obligations toward parents and homeland, honoring parents and country. So that's secular piety. So piety is not just restricted to religions. Secular folks have this notion as well. But remember, the core feature of piety in secularism is devotion. It is duty. If you also refer to modern English dictionaries, piety is defined as the following way: devout fulfillment of religious obligations. So this is very critical. Still, in modern English dictionary, piety is about duty and devotion, except this here it is duty towards religious beliefs and practices, religious obligations, so to speak. Well, guess what? Islamic taqwa has nothing to do with obligation or duty. It's just radically different. It's not about devotion to religious ideas, dogma. It's not about devotion to religious practices. So what is taqwa? Taqwa comes from the root word beqaya in English language. Did you know that? In Arabic. It comes from the root word beqaya. Now, if you have access to Arabic dictionary, look up beqaya. Beqaya means to protect, to ward off, to guard against, right? That's the root word for taqwa, beqaya. So beqaya is whatever protects from harm. This building has beqaya. What is the beqaya for this building? They're the columns, right? The columns in this building are beqaya because it protects it from falling down. Your car has beqaya. What is the beqaya for your car? It would be the brakes, right? The restraint system in your car. An umbrella is also beqaya. It means it protects us from the elements, from the sun and the rain. The shield in the old days was considered beqaya for warriors in the battlefield. So beqaya is a sort of self-restraining mechanism, a self-restraining mechanism. Just as every vehicle has a restraint system, God has equipped the human soul or nafs with a restraining system. Every single human person comes to this world with a restraint system pre-installed. It's not optional, so to speak, right? It comes as standard. Chapter 91, verses 7 through 10 pretty much informs us of that fact. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. By the soul and how he formed it and inspired it to know its rebellion and piety. The one who purifies his soul succeeds, and the one who corrupts it fails. So clearly, the verse says that the soul of every human person has a built-in restraining mechanism, which is called taqwa. Now, the function of the restraint system is obviously to protect us from harm, from harming ourselves and harming other people. That's the whole point behind this restraint system. If we maintain our restraint system well, we're going to succeed in life. And if we neglect to maintain it, we will fail. We will fail because our inner brakes would not function when we need it the most, when you need to make certain critical decisions in life. It's not functioning. It's like putting on the brakes, it doesn't work, right? So the message I have for you according to the Quran, your taqwa is something you have to work on day in and day out. Just like whenever, your car, every few thousand miles, you have to take your car into the repair shop in order to do maintenance work on the brakes, right? So that's what we need to do with our internal brake, our restraint system as well. Now, so far the Quran informs us that we have this inner brake, right? The Quran goes beyond that. It says that in order for your inner shield, this inner guard, to work optimally, to perform at its optimal level, you need to have the right and the appropriate mindset. You have to have the appropriate mental frame. The Quran calls this appropriate mental frame and mindset taqwa. Taqwa. So notice that taqwa is a phrase composed of two words, taqwa, which means piety, and Allah, which means God. So taqwa, your inner brake, works in this inner environment. What does taqwa mean? Taqwa is often translated incorrectly in English as fear of God. So if you just go and grab, an English translation of the Holy Quran here, whenever you come across the word taqwa, I guarantee you, and right underneath it, it's going to say fear God, right? In my opinion, fear of God is not, it doesn't do justice to the notion of taqwa. Taqwa really means reverence for God, not fear of God, but rather a reverence for God. Reverence is a feeling or an attitude of respect. When you stand in front of somebody and you are full of respect for that person, and that respect is tinged with awe, that is called reverence. So taqwa is a mental state or a consciousness in which a person is fully aware of being in the presence of God. The person deeply feels the presence of God and acts accordingly, right? Just to use an analogy so I drive the point home, just imagine that a surveillance camera followed you every moment of your life. I submit to you that the presence of that surveillance camera would weigh in your decision making, in the choices you make, in what you do, right? You would definitely behave differently. Now, taqwa is exactly the same way. God weighs heavily in the person's decision making, choices, priorities, so on and so forth. You see, there is a difference between viewing God as a theological concept versus a presence. You see, most of us are, because we come from a traditional religious background, we typically view God as a theological concept. But there is another way of looking at God as a presence. In other words, God is not way up there somewhere over the clouds, but God has really filled up everywhere. There is nowhere in the world in which God is not fully present. Now, let me give you a verse in the Holy Quran that clarifies that. Now I submit to you, that's an exercise. Just if you go read the Quran cover to cover, you will, whenever there is talk of God or description of God, God is never talked about in terms of like a theological concept. It's always in terms of a presence. Chapter 2, verse 255. This is a very famous part of the Quran. I'm sure many of you recite these verses when you get out of home every day. It's what we call Ayatul Kursi, right? Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum la ta'khuzuhu sinatun wala naw. So beautiful the way it articulates about God. It says, God, there is no God but Him, the ever living, the ever watchful. Neither slumber nor sleep overtakes Him. Al-Hayy. What does Al-Hayy mean in Arabic? Al-Hayy means ever present, never absent from the scene, even for one moment. In other words, God is always present in this world. Al-Qayyum means sustainer of life, sustainer of the world. Existence depends on God, or as our mystics would tell us, God is existence. Everything else is nothing but an illusion. Only God exists. So, a pious person sees God as all present, all watchful. In fact, God's watchful eyes are right inside us. You see, God doesn't watch over us from the outside, believe it or not. God's watchful eyes are directly inside us. We typically call this our conscience, or in Farsi, wujdan. So conscience, which is the deepest layer of our soul, is truly God's eyes inside every single human person. It is our conscience and the inner guard that enables us to respect the rights of others, or as the Quran says, to respect boundaries, hudud, right? To respect boundaries, even if no policeman is present, right? So the presence or absence of a policeman would not alter the behavior of a person of piety. So it's a moot point. The presence or absence of an outside guard does not alter the behavior of a pious person. So this was a sort of introduction to get you introduced to this concept of Taqwa in the Holy Quran. Now let me delve deeper into piety and also address some misconceptions about it. There are two aspects to piety: negative piety and positive piety. So whenever we talk about piety, both aspects need to be had in mind. By the way, negative doesn't mean bad or undesirable. So when we talk about negative piety, it doesn't mean that sort of piety is bad, undesirable, and we should avoid it. Negative simply means negating. So negative piety means having the ability to say no, to refrain from, or as the Christians would say, to resist temptation. So this is one aspect of piety. So we are able to say no to certain things in life, to put a brake on, not do certain things. Positive piety, on the other hand, is the ability to embrace and do certain things, right? That one means refrain. Negative piety means refraining from doing certain things. Positive piety means the ability to embrace and do certain things. Um, I'm sure you're all familiar with Rumi, right? Is anybody who doesn't know Rumi in this crowd? Rumi is perhaps the most famous Muslim mystics that ever lived. And I'm a fan of Rumi, I just adore him. And tonight I'm going to share with you some of his religious and spiritual insights. In his spiritual Rumi, so here I'm talking about negative piety, right? So in his spiritual journey, Rumi realized that in order to reap sweet rewards, he had to initially refrain from certain sweet things. In other words, he had to refrain from certain pleasures in order to reap sweet rewards at the end. گر سخن خواهی که گویی چون شکر صبر کن از حرص و این حلوا مخور صبر باشد مشتهای زیرکان هست حلوا آرزوی کودکان. If you wish to utter words like sugar, refrain from craving and do not eat this sweet meat. Self-control is the thing desired by the intelligent. Sweet meat is what children long for. In other words, if you want to utter sweet words, you have to close your mouth on certain sweet things initially. Then you will speak sweet words. What he's basically saying is the following, in a nutshell, that if you want to make progress in any field in life, you have to make sacrifices. You have to initially hold back from certain pleasures. This is true of progress in the academic field, in the business world, and also in the spiritual world. This is typically what we call, especially philosophers call, self-deprivation. In other words, you deprive yourself knowingly, intelligently, and willingly, right? It's not somebody is forcing you to not do something, but willingly you refrain from doing certain things, right? So this is what we call self-deprivation. So self-deprivation and prohibition is really not meant to rob us from happiness and joy. It's the exact opposite. Self-deprivation and prohibition is really an enabler. It empowers us to grow and improve, because without prohibition, no improvement is possible. Unfortunately, it is the negative aspect of piety that is typically emphasized in ordinary traditional religious families. I'm sure the young people in the audience would agree with me on that. In other words, in traditional religious families, in Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, it doesn't matter. Typically, parents ask kids or tell kids, don't wear this, don't eat that, don't watch that. It's all about no's, things that we should not do. So it's as if, I see a lot of smile on this side, right? It's true. You know, I come from, you know, a traditional religious family as well. It's as if religion is nothing but a long list of no's, things that we should not do. Whereas that's not piety, right? It's not the things that you should not do. Piety is about things that you should crave for, things that you should aspire to do, things that you should love to do, right? So we need to have positive reinforcements as well. And unfortunately, this is what is missing in traditional religious discourse and upbringing. I really believe that a religion that has more don'ts than do's is going to be in trouble in the modern world, right? A religion that has more no's than yeses, don'ts than do's, is going to be in deep trouble in the modern world. Anyhow, the disproportional emphasis on avoidance makes piety like something which is suitable only for saints, people who have no interest in the affairs of this world. Is piety really for saints only, or only saints are supposed to be pious? Well, since this is a common misunderstanding and a widespread misunderstanding, let me address that for a few minutes. So just bear with me. The Islamic term for negative piety, what is that? I mean, what is negative piety called in Islamic theology? It is called zuhd. Zuhd is the Islamic term for negative piety. Zuhd, and here I want to address a misunderstanding about zuhd. You see, zuhd, literally, it means to abstain from, to hold in low regard. That's what zuhd means. So the Islamic concept of zuhd is often misunderstood and mistaken with asceticism. Asceticism. So it's not the same thing. I mean, if you look up zuhd in dictionary, usually right in front of it, it says it means asceticism. It's not the same thing. Let me clarify. Asceticism, by the way, is huge in Hinduism. The Hindu tradition is big on asceticism. Asceticism involves denial of bodily desires. So the ascetic would shun the world altogether. He would eat very little, maybe a few nuts every day. He would not bathe regularly. So asceticism really is a life of solitude. The goal in asceticism is the acquisition of a spiritual power, to have power over the soul as well as the natural world. As I said, Hinduism has a very strong ascetic tradition. Early Christianity also developed an ascetic tradition. It's called Monastic Asceticism. It evolved probably in the 2nd and the 3rd century AD in Europe. The monastic lifestyle was all about poverty, about celibacy, disregard for personal hygiene and solitude. That's what monks did in monasteries in the Middle Ages. Now, why is this misunderstanding? Why some people equate the Islamic negative piety or zuhd with asceticism? I really believe that the Quran has something to do with that. In other words, there are certain verses in the Holy Quran that those verses have a dim view of this world. In Arabic, what do we call this world? What do we call this word in Arabic or in the Quran? It's called dunya, ad-dunya. So I'm going to share with you some verses in the Quran that really looks down on ad-dunya, or this world. So when you read these verses, if you really don't understand what the Quran is saying, you would say, that asceticism, we are supposed to shun this world. We're supposed to hold this word in very low regard. Let me share one verse with you. That's in chapter 57, verse 20. اعلموا إنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد. Bear in mind that the present life is just a game. The present life is just a game, a diversion, an attraction, a cause of boasting among you, of rivalry in wealth and children. So this is how the Quran defines dunya. And then if we take this verse on its face value, I submit to you that we are to avoid marriage. We should not get involved in commerce. We shouldn't get involved in politics, right? That if we take this verse on its face value. And then the verse ends with an admonition. وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا مَتَاعُ الْغُرُورِ. The life of this world is only an illusory pleasure. In other words, this verse is telling us that this world is only a mirage. When you get out of bed in the morning and you rush outside, you get in your car and you rush to work, you're really chasing an illusion. This is just a mirage. The Quran says in other verses that for the pious, the hereafter, akhirah, is better than ad-dunya. Chapter 6, verse 22 specifically says that وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ وَلَلدَّارُ الْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. The life of this world is nothing but a game and a distraction. The home in the hereafter is best for those who are pious. Why will you people not understand? So this verse is challenging the pious that this world is not of a consequence to you. It is the hereafter that is very important. So I submit to you that if you read these verses in the Quran literally, then it basically is telling you to have this world in low regard. Now, to make a long story short, the Quranic usage of ad-dunya, well, let me also say something before I get to this. So these verses are offered to you on the one hand, but we know that there are other verses in the Quran that directly ask us to get involved in the affairs of this world, right? So how do we reconcile these verses that I just recited to you with the verses that command us to take an interest in the affairs of this world, to get married and have children, to get involved in politics, to get involved in commerce, to fight for social justice? What are we supposed to do after our Friday prayer is done? What does the Quran ask us to do? Just go out there and get involved in commerce, right? So how do we reconcile these verses? So let me address that for a second, because that is the source of misunderstanding. You see, to make a long story short, the Quranic usage of ad-dunya and al-akhirah have dual meanings. Ad-dunya and akhirah sometimes refer to the present life versus the afterlife. So this is one usage of the term. There is another usage which refers to a person's lifestyle, right? A person's lifestyle. So in the present life, you have two options, two different lifestyles. One, a lifestyle of ad-dunya, and a lifestyle of al-akhirah. In other words, the lifestyle of ad-dunya is a lifestyle in which the person is forgetful of God. And the lifestyle of akhirah is one that the person is mindful of the presence of God. Let me elaborate some more. You see, ad-dunya really, in the current context, means transient. Transient. Anything that is short-lived. Anything that has an expiration date built into it. Akhirah, on the contrary, means anything that is durable, anything that is lasting, anything that is permanent. A person's life becomes mata'ul ghurur, an illusory pleasure, when the person mistakes transient things with things that are lasting and permanent. Let me repeat one more time. In our daily lives, sometimes we mistake, we confuse things that are transient, things that will ultimately die. We confuse those with things that are lasting and permanent. Let me give you some examples. What are some of the things that are transient when we typically confuse them with the lasting and the durable? Youth, physical beauty, wealth, power, social status, popularity. These can be taken away from us at one moment's notice. We can lose it all. We can lose our health overnight. We can lose our wealth overnight. Our popularity can tank overnight, right? So these are things that are transient by the very nature. Unfortunately, the great majority of us confuse them with things that are permanent and lasting. So these are attributes of ad-dunya. So anytime the Quran holds ad-dunya in low regard, it is these things that we should really not invest in and boast about them. So if you are young, if you have physical beauty, if you have popularity, don't be boastful, because they can be taken away from you overnight. If you are boastful of them, it's as if you are building your house on sand. It is unwise. That's what the Quran is warning us against. I think my best friend Rumi articulated that the best. I mean, he's just amazing in the way he can visualize and articulate a lot of this wisdom. He basically tells us how we should treat this world, ad-dunya, in the context that I just shared with you. How we should really treat worldly pursuits. چیست دنیا؟ از خدا غافل بودن. This is the definition of the dunya. چیست دنیا؟ از خدا غافل بودن. نی قماش و نقره و میزان و زن. مال را که از بحر دین باشی حمول. نعم مال صالحون خواندش رسول. What is this world at dunya? What is this world? To be forgetful of God. It is not merchandise and silver and weighing scales and women. As regards to the wealth that you carry for religion's sake, the Prophet said, how good is righteous wealth for the righteous man. And then Rumi shares with us an analogy to drive the point home. آب در کشتی هلاک کشتی است. آب اندر زیر کشتی پشتی است. Water in the boat is the ruin of the boat, but water underneath the boat is a support. So that's how we should look at this world. This is how we should look at wealth, status, power, and so on and so forth. If water comes inside the boat, it will sink. But as long as water is underneath the boat will ride on the waves and lead to destination. So power, wealth, status, these are really neutral by definition. How you use them determines whether they are good or bad. Now we can probably better understand negative piety or zuhd. I went through all this exposition so that now we have a better grasp of what zuhd means, Islamic zuhd or negative piety. You see, zuhd does not mean abstaining from the world. It means abstaining from the corruption of the world, right? Not to get corrupted and tainted by the corruptive influences and decadent influences of this world. Now let me share with you a couple of beautiful quotations that illustrate what piety is. Abu Hamid Muhammad Ghazali is one of the most famous theologians of all time. He said the following: تقوا در آن نیست که انسان چیزی نداشته باشد، بلکه این است که داشته باشد ولی دلش در بند آن نباشد. Piety doesn't mean that a man should be penniless, but his heart should not be enslaved by love of possessions. So possessions are not bad. Attachment to possessions is bad. So this is really what essential piety is all about. So are we running out of time?
No.
Okay, so let me go over a couple of other items and I'm going to close the lecture. So far, hopefully, we have a good understanding of what piety means in Islamic theology. So what are some of the tangible benefits? So what are some of the fruits of piety? So a person of piety, what can he or she expect? First, piety, as should be clear by now, is a moral enabler. Is a moral enabler. It enables us to lead a moral life without exception. All Islamic moral commandments are rooted in taqwa or piety. Every single moral commandment in Islam springs out of piety, which means if you are low on piety, you can never be a moral person. Let me give you just one example. Justice. Justice, as you know, is a very important moral virtue in Islam. The Quran repeatedly asks us to be just and fair in our dealings with others. And then in chapter 5, verse 8, the Quran says, "I'dilu, i'dilu huwa aqrabu lit-taqwa." Adhere to justice, for it is closer to piety. Adhere to justice because it is closer to piety. In other words, if you are pious, it will be easier for you to be fair and just in your dealings with others. The same holds true for all other moral virtues. Goodness, truthfulness, compassion, generosity, humility, they are all rooted in piety. Not everyone can live by these standards. These virtues will only appear in a person who has cultivated his soul, right? If our soul is cultivated, then we are capable of being a moral person. That's one of the first benefits of piety. The second one should be fairly intuitive. As the saying goes, doing good makes you feel good, right? Doing good makes you feel good. So, if you do good because you are a pious person, you will have peace in life, you will be a joyful person, you will have self-contentment. These are the spiritual fruits that come and emerge out of piety. So these are some of the benefits of piety. Piety also leads to purity of heart and soul. This benefit of piety is so critical to Islamic mysticism. See, so let me elaborate on this a little bit. Piety is so critical to having a pure heart. What does purity, by the way, what does purity mean? If you look it up in English dictionary, purity means freedom from anything that debases, contaminates, and pollutes. Freedom from pollutants. So in the spiritual realm, purity means freedom from selfishness, from greed, covetousness, all of these evils, right? So freedom from these moral contaminants. That's what purity means. They contaminate and they pollute our soul. If our baqaya, the inner guard, is weak, these pollutants will come inside and pollute our heart and our soul. On the contrary, if the inner guard, baqaya, is very strong, then it will stop all the pollutants from coming in and messing up with our mind, our soul, and our heart. The Quran makes a very important pronouncement, by the way. It said, Al-Khabisatu للخبيثين والخبيثون للخبيثات والطيبات للطيبين والطيبون للطيبات. The same thing is repeated 4 times because it's so critical. It says, corrupt women are for corrupt men, and corrupt men are for corrupt women. Pure women are for pure men, and for pure women are for pure men, and pure men are for pure women. You might wonder, why does the Quran just keeps repeating the same thing? Because it's very important. This verse actually explains to us the structure of the spiritual world. You see, the structure of the spiritual world is such that purity attracts purity and filth attracts filth. God is pure, and he will manifest himself only in a pure heart. God will come near only to a pure heart. So anyone who aspires to meet God, to interact with God, to receive inspirations from God, needs to purify her heart and her soul. This is an absolute requirement. Rumi, in book 1 of Masnavi, tells a fictional story to illustrate this point, that purity is required for God's revelation. Do you want God to speak to you today? This is how you can prepare for that. This is how Rumi articulates this important point. Again, this is a fictional story. He says the Romans and the Chinese had an intense dispute over who was more skillful in the art of painting. The Chinese said we are better artists. The Romans argued, no, we are better artists. The king said, let's settle this dispute in a civil manner. Let's not fight over that. So he set up an art contest and said the Chinese and the Romans should duke it out in this art contest so we can figure out who is more skillful in the art of painting. They picked a big room. They picked a big room and they made it the contest arena. They assigned one wall to the Chinese and the opposite wall to the Romans. And they put a curtain in between the 2 walls so that the artists would not copy from each other. They would not cheat. The Chinese asked the king to give them the essential painting materials, painting brush, paint, so on and so forth. The Romans, on the other hand, they didn't ask for any painting materials. رومیان گفتند نی لون و نرنگ در خورایت کار را جز دفع زنگ در فرو بستند و صیقل می زدند همچو گردون ساده و صافی شدند. So the Chinese started painting on their wall and they painted gorgeous pictures. The Romans, on the other hand, they said we don't need any painting materials. The Romans said no tints and no colors are proper for our work. Nothing needed except to remove the rust. They shut the door and went on burnishing. They became clear and pure like the sky. So instead of painting on their assigned walls, the Romans started burnishing the wall. In other words, they made their wall really smooth and bright. They burnished their wall so much and so well, it turned into a mirror, right? So the Roman wall turned into a mirror. The judgment day came. So the king came to visit the Chinese and the Roman walls. The king first visited the Chinese wall. he really loved what he saw on the Chinese wall. Beautiful pictures, gorgeous pictures. He admired them. And then he went towards the Roman wall that had no paintings on it. بعد از آن آمد به سوی رومیان، پرده را برداشت رومی از میان. عکس آن تصویر و آن کردارها، زد بر آن صافی شده دیوارها. هرچه آنجا دید اینجا به نمود، دیده را از دیده خانه می ربود. After that, the king came towards the Romans. They removed the intervening curtain. The reflection of those Chinese pictures and works of art struck upon these walls, which had been made pure from stain. All that he had seen there on the Chinese wall seemed even more beautiful here. It was snatching the eye from the socket. So you get the picture, right? So when they removed the curtain, the reflection of the Chinese picture appeared on the Roman wall. Now Rumi shares with us a very important insight. رومیان آن صوفیانند ای پدر، بیز تکرار و کتاب و بی هنر. لیک صیقل کرده آن سینه ها، پاک از آز و حرص و بخل و کینه ها. آن صفای آینه لاشک دل است، کون و هوش بی عدد را قابل است. The Romans, O father, are the Sufis. They are without study and books and erudition, but they have burnished their hearts and made them pure from greed and cupidity and avarice and hatreds. That purity of mirror is beyond doubt the heart which receives images innumerable. In other words, a heart that is pure is capable of receiving innumerable images from God. So if you clear your heart from evils, then you can receive truths, insights, and revelations from God. In other words, revelations is not only for prophets. Every single human person is capable of receiving revelations from God. It has one critical requirement: purity of heart. Guess what? Where did God reveal his verses to the Prophet Muhammad? Did somebody speak? Did Gabriel, angel Gabriel, did the angel Gabriel speak in the Prophet's ears? Is that how revelation came down to the Prophet Muhammad? That's what we are told in most mosques, right? That's not the case according to the Holy Quran. Listen to this declaration from the Holy Quran. It says, we revealed the verses of the Quran to the Prophet's pure heart. فَإِنَّهُ نَزَّلَهُ عَلَىٰ قَلْبِكَ بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. Gabriel, by God's leave, brought down the Quran to your pure heart. In other words, when the Prophet's heart was clear of all the pollutants, all the evils, then it became capable of receiving inspirations and revelations from God. Again, the word for all of this in the Quran is Taqwa, because it basically enables us to purify your heart as well. So this is the third important benefit of Taqwa. Taqwa gives us purity of heart and soul. I hate not to tell you this before I close the lecture, how to boost our piety. I know that you are very devout Muslims, you practice Islam selflessly. So how can we boost our taqwa or piety according to the Quran? Have you ever thought about that? How can we boost our piety? How many of you fast every year? You all do, right? So listen to what the Quran says about the philosophy of fasting, right? یا ایها الذین آمنوا کتب علیکم الصیام کما کتب علی الذین من قبلکم لعلکم تتقون. You who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may become pious. You may become pious. So the true purpose of fasting is to boost our piety. Remember, fasting is not about losing weight. It's about losing vices. Losing vices. Fasting is all about self-restraint, which is taqwa, right? It's all about enhancing our self-restraint mechanism. For 30 days, we essentially do maintenance work on our internal brake system, on our internal restraint system. We say no to our basic urges, to food, to drink, so that it becomes easier for us to say no to the calls of the ego, to the calls of the carnal soul. I don't know whether you caught it or not, but in the verse puts a condition for fasting leading to piety. Did you catch that? It says لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Maybe, possibly, your fasting will enable you to become more pious. It's not definitive, there is no guarantee. Why do you think the Quran sets this condition? It's because some of us fast because we do it as an obligation. Don't ever look at fasting as an obligation, because when this is an obligation for you, what do you do? You are counting the minutes to sunset so you can go for food and just kill yourself, right? People who view fasting as an obligation, I submit to you, they really love to see Ramadan end. As soon as Ramadan is over, there are people in my own family who are like that. So they would love nothing but the fasting period to be over so they can get on with the business of life, right? So if somebody really views fasting like that, I submit to you that his share of fasting is nothing but hunger and thirst. His share of fasting is nothing but hunger and thirst. Remember, fasting is not about starving our stomach. It is about starving our ego, our carnal soul, nafs al-ammara. We need to deprive our ego from nutrients. So if I have to say it in Farsi, because just this is the really nice way to put it. روزه گرسنه نگه داشتن نفس هست، نه شکم. Fasting is about starving our carnal soul and not our stomach. I guess I've said enough about piety. Hopefully you got, a sense for what Islam means by piety. Let me conclude with 4 messages that I have for you. Number 1, piety transcends religious domination. Piety is not the exclusive divine realm and domain of any particular religion. All religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, so on and so forth, they equally provide a path for their followers to be pious, which basically means there are Muslims out there who are not pious, and there are a lot of pious people out there who are not Muslims. That's number 1. Secondly, piety or taqwa should not be mixed up with religious beliefs. A person can have very strong and unwavering religious beliefs. He can be a fanatic, but at the same time, his piety tank can be very low. He can score very low on piety. This is quite possible. 3, piety will not be attained will not be boosted by increasing our devotion to religious dogma or increasing the volume of our prayers. So don't think that by praying more, you will become more pious. It is only by working on our vakaya, on our inner guard, our restraint system, that our piety is going to increase. Lastly, do not gauge your piety and your purity by your religious beliefs and practices. Gauge your purity and piety with the content of your character. It is your character where piety will show itself, will reveal itself. Anyhow, I hope that I didn't bore you to death and you got some value out of this presentation. Thank you very much. Have a good night.